They say nearly 3 out of 4 people lie awake at night, not from pain, not from noise, but from the quiet that follows it. A silence so deep it feels like falling. Have you ever felt that? That strange unease that comes when everything is calm, yet your heart still races as if it's running from something unseen? Most call it anxiety, but it's older than that. It's the soul's hunger for stillness. And the tragedy is this: the more you chase peace, the further it seems to drift. If that already stirs something inside you, don't turn away, because what follows might show you why you've never truly felt at home within yourself. Inner peace is not a state you achieve. It is what remains when everything that isn't you has fallen away. But most people never get that far because they've mistaken noise for life. The constant hum of doing, fixing, performing. They think movement means meaning. They think quiet means failure. And so they live with the ache, that low, constant hum beneath their thoughts. The modern wound, a restless mind trapped in a tired body. They scroll, they search, they compare, hoping to feel something, anything that confirms they still exist. But peace does not come through confirmation. It comes through disappearance. Have you noticed how the more you try to control your thoughts, the louder they become? How the more you force calm, the more chaos answers? It is because peace is not a conquest. It is a surrender. There was once a woman who spent years meditating, fasting, traveling from teacher to teacher, searching for peace. But every time she sat in silence, her body filled with anger. Every time she tried to quiet her mind, her memories screamed louder. She thought she was failing, that peace was something she had not yet earned. Until one night she stopped trying. She let the noise stay, and in that letting go, something shifted. Not outside, but within. She realized peace is not the absence of pain. It is the willingness to sit beside it without flinching. That was the first movement of the soul, the habit of allowing, the capacity to let life happen without rushing to fix it. It is a habit of the spirit, not the mind, a remembering that nothing you resist can ever truly leave you. And yet, this habit is the hardest to learn because the ego believes control is safety. It doesn't understand that control is the very thing keeping it in chains. So many walk through life clenched, holding on to old stories, old lovers, old failures, like relics of identity. They do not realize that the reason they feel heavy is because they never stop carrying. They fear letting go because they think they will vanish. But what if the self you are protecting was never truly you? Have you noticed how peace feels terrifying at first? Like death wearing gentleness as a disguise. That's because, in a way, it is a death. The death of who you thought you were supposed to be. And this is where the descent begins. The moment you stop seeking light and allow yourself to enter the shadow. Because peace is not found in escaping darkness. It is born there. The mind does not know peace because it does not know how to stop. It turns even rest into effort, even love into performance, even stillness into a task to be achieved. That is why the first true step toward peace feels like falling apart, because everything false begins to crumble the moment truth enters. The moment you realize that your thoughts were never yours, only echoes of fear and memory wearing your voice. And isn't it strange that the more you try to be spiritual, the less human you feel? Because spirituality is not about rising above the mess. It's about falling deeply into it, until you see that nothing was ever separate to begin with. The woman who learned to allow found that her peace grew not from silence, but from honesty. When she stopped pretending to be calm and allowed herself to be chaotic, she found a strange clarity hidden in the storm. When she stopped reaching for perfection, she discovered beauty in imperfection itself. And in that paradox, the union of chaos and calm, she touched something sacred. Not enlightenment, not transcendence, but presence. That was when she began to understand the second movement of the soul. Though she could not yet name it, it whispered through her dreams, through the soft ache of morning, through the eyes of strangers she once ignored. Because peace, when it finally finds you, does not arrive as bliss. It arrives as understanding, and understanding is never comfortable. But the story doesn't end there, because allowing opens the door, but what waits behind it is far more dangerous. The next habit isn't gentle. It demands something you've spent your whole life avoiding. The next habit asks you to lose everything you thought you needed to feel whole. They say the greatest illusion is control, that thin thread we cling to, convinced it keeps our world from falling apart. But have you noticed how tightly people hold their own pain, as if it were proof of life? How they measure safety by the familiarity of their suffering? It's strange how the very thing that hurts us most is often what we're most afraid to release. The second movement of the soul is the habit of surrendering. Not submission, not defeat, but the quiet recognition that peace cannot bloom where fear still dictates the terms of existence. A man once stood at the edge of a river, watching the current move faster than his courage. He wanted to cross, but each time he stepped closer, his body froze. He feared the unknown, not because it was dangerous, but because it was free, and freedom terrified him. Have you felt that too? That trembling hesitation when life invites you to let go of control, of outcomes, of the idea that you can plan your way into peace. Because every time you cling to certainty, you close the door through which grace might enter. Surrender does not mean losing the self. It means losing the illusion that the self was ever in charge. There's a kind of exhaustion that no sleep can fix, the fatigue of trying to hold the universe in your hands. The human mind, when frightened, builds walls, but the soul, it builds rivers, and rivers are not meant to be held, only entered. Surrender is not a one-time act. It is a rhythm, the constant falling back into trust again and again, even when your faith has splintered. Especially then, it is the moment you stop asking why things happen and start watching how they unfold. Because the soul doesn't need answers. It needs intimacy with what is. A woman once said, "Every time I tried to control my life, it slipped away like water through my fingers. But the day she stopped fighting, the river carried her somewhere she'd never been. Not a place, but a state where she no longer needed to make sense of her path, because she could feel its intelligence." That is the secret most never learn. Peace is not found through understanding life. It's found through trusting it. And isn't it strange how trust feels like falling until you realize the ground was never solid to begin with? In Jung's language, surrender is the descent, the necessary dying of the ego, the part of us that insists it must know, must control, must win. But every descent is also an initiation. To surrender is to walk willingly into the dark forest of not knowing, guided only by the faint glow of awareness that refuses to die. This is where many turn back. Because to surrender feels like erasure, like becoming no one. And the modern self, built from validation, projection, identity, cannot bear the thought of dissolving. But if you have ever felt the ache of losing what you thought you needed, you've already touched the edge of surrender. That grief you felt was not punishment, it was purification. Imagine a wave crashing onto the shore, furious, magnificent, unstoppable. Then imagine it sinking back into the ocean, returning to the vastness from which it came. That is what surrender truly is. The return, the recognition that you were never separate from the ocean in the first place. When a man or woman learns this, something ancient begins to awaken. The understanding that control is not strength, it is resistance. And peace does not live in resistance, it lives in rhythm. The rhythm of breath, the rhythm of trust, the rhythm of letting things die when it is their time to die. The woman by the river stopped fighting. She let herself float. And though the current pulled her in directions she didn't expect, she began to see patterns. The way the water curved around stones, the way it slowed in certain bends, the way it deepened in silence. She realized that life had always been this way, that her struggles were not obstacles but invitations to flow differently. For the first time she understood, the opposite of control isn't chaos, it's harmony. The harmony that appears only when you stop trying to conduct the music and start listening to it. But surrender does not end in stillness. It leads to another threshold, one most people never dare to cross. Because once you've released control, something unexpected happens. You begin to see the truth of your own emptiness. And that emptiness, that vast echoing quiet inside, is not peace yet. It's a mirror. And mirrors, as you'll see, don't just reflect what's beautiful. They show what's been hidden. After surrender, something terrifying happens. Everything goes quiet. No noise, no struggle, no story to hold on to. Just the vast and endless reflection of what is. At first, the silence feels holy. Then it feels unbearable. Because in that silence, you begin to see yourself. Not the version you show to the world, but the one that hides beneath all your pretending. And that, for most, is where peace turns into panic. Have you noticed how uncomfortable people become when things are too quiet? They fidget, they scroll, they fill the air with words, because silence has a way of revealing what we've buried. This is the third movement of the soul, the habit of stillness. Not the stillness of posture, but of perception. The stillness that no longer needs to change the moment before it has been felt. Stillness is not passive. It is the deepest kind of courage because it requires you to stop escaping yourself, to stop performing healing and simply be what's left. When the woman who once surrendered began to sit in stillness, she felt everything she had avoided for years rise up like ghosts, old betrayals, forgotten shames, the quiet ache of never having been seen. Her instinct was to run, to distract, to fix, to transcend, but the silence wouldn't let her. It held her, it mirrored her, and slowly she began to see. These ghosts weren't her enemies. They were fragments of her soul, waiting to be heard. Jung called this confrontation the meeting with the shadow, the sacred descent into the parts of the psyche we exile. Stillness is the place where that meeting happens. It is the mirror that reflects the monster until we realize the monster was only misunderstood innocence. And isn't it strange that what we fear most is often what we've never actually looked at? Stillness breaks the illusion that peace means comfort. True peace demands exposure. It wants to see everything, the holy and the broken, the serene and the ashamed. And as you watch, something begins to shift. The shame softens, the anger unravels, even grief becomes translucent. Because what is truly seen loses its power to haunt. There's a story, older than any religion, of a sage who meditated by a pond. Each day he stared into the still water until he could no longer tell where his reflection ended and the world began. One evening, a child asked him, "What do you see?" The sage smiled and said, "Everything that frightens me, until it no longer does." That is stillness. The slow, fearless seeing of the truth until fear becomes unnecessary, because fear can only live where awareness refuses to look. When you sit in stillness, you start to notice the subtle movements of life that control once drowned out, the way a breath deepens without permission, the way the heart pulses without being asked. You begin to feel how intelligence is not something you create. It's something you belong to. And in that realization, a strange kind of gentleness appears. A gentleness that doesn't mean weakness. It means intimacy with existence. Because the moment you stop resisting the flow of your inner world, even your pain begins to cooperate. Stillness teaches one more secret, that peace was never meant to be felt as a constant state. It's meant to be known as the nature of what you are. When the mind grows quiet, even for a moment, you begin to sense that you were never the storm, only the sky holding it. And suddenly, everything changes. Not because life becomes easier, but because you stop demanding that it should. You start to understand why the river flowed as it did, why loss arrived when it did, why silence had to hurt before it could heal. But here lies the paradox. Stillness gives you peace, but it also strips you of meaning. Without the noise, without the struggle, the question arises, who am I now? And that question, whispered into the quiet of a stilled soul, is not a question at all. It's a doorway into the fourth movement of the soul, one that does not soothe but transforms. Because once you face the mirror, the next step is to love what you see, even if it never changes. And that is where most break. For love, real love, begins not with another, but with the acceptance of your own shadow. And very few ever make it that far. After stillness comes something quieter still. Not silence, but awareness, breathing through silence. It is here that the fourth movement of the soul reveals itself, the habit of compassionate seeing, the capacity to look upon your shadow, your wounds, your contradictions, and not turn away. Because peace is not found in fixing yourself. It is born the moment you stop seeing yourself as something broken. When the woman who learned to allow, surrender, and be still finally met her reflection, she expected judgment. Instead, she found tenderness, not from the world, but from something ancient within her that had watched her suffer without ever condemning her. It had been there the entire time. The quiet witness that neither blamed nor forgave because it had never seen her as guilty in the first place. That was the first time she cried without despair, not because she was sad, but because she realized she had been loved, even in her most unlovable moments. Have you ever felt that strange, wordless ache when kindness touches a part of you that has never known it before? That's what compassion feels like when it first wakes up. It doesn't rush to heal you. It simply holds you until you stop needing to be healed. The mind wants resolution. The heart wants reunion. But the soul wants recognition, to be seen as it truly is, not as it should be. And in that seeing, something miraculous happens. The fragments of the self begin to remember each other. The parts that once fought, fear and courage, pride and shame, anger and love, stop struggling for dominance and begin to dance. Because they realize they were never enemies, only opposites longing to become whole. Isn't it strange how much of human suffering is born from trying to be only half of what we are? Always good, never dark, always calm, never wild, always in control, never vulnerable. But compassion dissolves this war. It looks at the whole and says, yes, even this. Jung said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And yet it is the only doorway to freedom. Because peace is not perfection, it's permission. The permission to feel what you feel, to want what you want, to love what you love, even when it doesn't fit the script. The woman who once feared her chaos began to see that her anger was only unspoken truth, that her sadness was only unexpressed love. She stopped labeling her emotions as right or wrong. She began to listen to them as messages from the depths, each one carrying a fragment of wisdom disguised as discomfort. When she did, her life didn't become easier. It became truer. And truth has a way of bringing peace, even when it hurts. Compassionate seeing is not weakness. It is the highest form of power, the kind that transforms without force. When you meet your inner critic with kindness, it begins to soften. When you meet your loneliness with curiosity, it begins to speak. When you meet your fear with presence, it begins to guide. And have you noticed how even your most painful memories begin to lose their poison once you stop fighting them? Because memory only hurts when it believes it must be hidden. This fourth habit is where many mistake peace for passivity. But to see with compassion is not to tolerate injustice or avoid pain. It's to meet them from a consciousness vast enough to contain both. It's to act from clarity instead of reaction, from love instead of defense. It's what happens when awareness grows so wide that nothing inside you needs to hide anymore. And when nothing hides, nothing controls you. That is the quiet freedom hidden inside compassion, the liberation not from pain, but from resistance. And yet something deeper waits beyond compassion, something even quieter, more formless. Because once you've seen yourself fully and loved what you've seen, what remains? No story, no self-image, only space. And that space, infinite, radiant, weightless, is not a void. It is the fifth and final movement of the soul, the moment when peace stops being a goal and becomes your nature. But to reach that place, one must die again, not physically, but symbolically. For the last habit requires the final surrender, to dissolve even the identity of the one who is at peace. When all striving ceases, when allowing surrender, stillness, and compassion have done their quiet work, what remains is not what most expect, not light, not ecstasy, not even joy. What remains is vastness, a clear, endless awareness where even the idea of you begins to loosen. It feels at first like vanishing, like the soul stepping into a silence so deep it forgets its own name. And that is precisely what it is. This is the fifth movement of the soul, the habit of dissolving. It is not something you practice. It is something that happens to you once all resistance has been loved into stillness. This is the fifth movement of the soul, the habit of dissolving. It is not something you practice. It is something that happens to you once all resistance has been loved into stillness. The woman who once fought for control, who learned to allow, to surrender, to sit in stillness, and to see with compassion, now found herself in a strange calm that neither rose nor fell. Days passed like clouds drifting over a vast sea. The waves still moved, but the sea beneath them did not. One morning, she sat watching the sunrise, and as the light poured through her window, she realized she was not watching the light. She was the light, perceiving itself through a temporary form. Her breath, her heartbeat, the warmth of the sun, all belonged to the same rhythm. There was no observer left to find peace, only peace observing itself through her. Have you ever had a moment, perhaps for only a few seconds, when you felt as though everything was exactly as it should be? When the mind stopped naming, comparing, analyzing, and simply was? That fleeting moment was not an accident. It was the truth breaking through the noise. That is what dissolving feels like. The quiet erasure of boundaries between self and life. It's not mystical, it's natural. It's what happens when the river finally remembers it was always the ocean. In Stoic philosophy, they called it apatheia, not apathy, but the serene equilibrium of a mind no longer enslaved by its own reactions. In Jung's language, it is the integration of the self, when the opposites have married and the psyche no longer fights itself. Alan Watts described it as the moment the dancer realizes there is no dance without the floor. Different words for the same realization. Peace is not something you find. It's what's left when there's nothing left to protect. But this disappearance is not an escape from life. It is a return to it, because once you dissolve into wholeness, even the smallest thing becomes luminous. The sound of rain on a window, the weight of a hand on yours, the hum of the world turning, unnoticed yet alive. You stop asking life for meaning. You start seeing that life is meaning, unfolding, breathing, expressing itself through every moment you once called ordinary. And this is the quiet secret behind all spiritual seeking. You were never meant to become peaceful. You are meant to remember that you already are. Every struggle, every heartbreak, every sleepless night, each one was carving space for this remembering. You weren't being punished. You were being prepared. Prepared to see that the peace you were chasing was never outside you, never in the silence, or the sunrise, or the meditation mat. It was in the gaze that watched all of it untouched. That gaze, that still point of awareness behind your thoughts, is who you have always been. The woman, now older, sits by that same river where she once tried to control the current. The water still rushes, the world still moves, but she no longer fights the flow. She lets the sound of it wash through her like memory. And for the first time, she doesn't even call it peace. She just calls it life. The sky stretches above her, vast, unbroken, infinite. And she feels it move through her lungs as she breathes. She smiles, not because she understands, but because she no longer needs to. So, if you have ever felt restless, lost, or disconnected, know this: you are not failing to find peace. You are walking its hidden path, a path that begins in resistance and ends in recognition. Because the people who struggle most with inner peace are often the ones closest to finding it. Their chaos is not a curse. It's a sign of awakening, the sound of old walls breaking so the light can enter. And when the dust finally settles, they will realize what she realized. Peace was never something to gain or lose. It was the essence beneath the noise, waiting patiently to be remembered. What once felt like loss now breathes like liberation. And in her silence, she finally hears it, the sound of her own soul returning home.